Bryce is a fellow at the Center for Energy Policy and the Environment at the Manhattan Institute. He joins us from Tulsa, Oklahoma tonight. Is this just the case where we're going to have to accept, as that person pointed out in the piece, a certain level of danger that if we're going to transport this much oil, no matter how safe we try to make the cars, there are going to be derailments?
Well, that's a good question, David. My reply would be we should be moving as much oil as we can by pipeline, which is far safer, it's cheaper, and that would be an obvious way that for safer transportation. But I think it's also important to put this in context. Your reporter mentioned it earlier, but since 2008, U.S. oil production has increased by about 4 million barrels per day. We've effectively added one Kuwait's worth of oil production here in the United States. We're at about 9.2 million barrels per day unexpectedly, and right now we simply don't have the pipeline capacity to move all the crude that's being produced here.
Well, we may not have the pipeline capacity, but we certainly have the rail capacity. And isn't it the burden of the U.S. government, of Congress and the administration to try to figure out some way to strengthen the rules if you're using cars that have design flaws dating back to the 1960s?
Well, and you raise an excellent question, and it's true. The train that derailed in West Virginia has many of the cars where the CP simply going to have to get better. They're going to have safer operations. They're going to have safer tank cars, and that's going to have to happen now. We've seen a number of these derailments, and you have a lot of communities along the rail lines, and they're concerned, and I don't blame them. But I'll just add one other point. There was a recent report that was put out just last October that pointed to the fact that ethanol is also moved by rail car, and we've had a lot of ethanol cars that have derailed. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago in Iowa, we had an ethanol train derail. Another fire. The ethanol tank cars ended up in the Mississippi River and are leaking. So this isn't just about the oil industry, it's also about ethanol as well.
Well, and it's also about the companies that are responsible for transporting the ethanol, the oil, or whatever they transport. It may be coal in certain circumstances. The railroad lines seem determined, and we saw this in West Virginia. Horrific snowstorm. The weather was clearly bad. There's some suggestions that might have played a role in the derailment. But can you talk about the pressure that some of these rail companies are under to move the product from point A to point B by a certain time?
Well, of course. I mean, the railroads have always been about efficiency, and they measure their efficiency by the speed of their trains. So they want to keep their trains moving, and we've seen the railroads go from effectively moving no crude oil in the United States just 4 or 5 years ago to now where they're moving roughly 800,000 barrels per day, which is roughly 9% of all U.S. crude production. It's an incredible increase in their tank car movements, and obviously they're under pressure to keep those tank cars moving. But as I said before, they're simply going to have to get safer. There's no other option here.
Robert Bryce, a fellow with the Center for Energy Policy and the Environment. Robert, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, David.